Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I thought I'd give a little bit of an explainer about some stuff that's floating around the federal debt and deficit. So, first of all, reminder that the deficit is the amount that the government on a year-to-year basis doesn't quite balance in terms of how much they spend versus how much they take in, and the debt is the accumulation of that. So it's the total of all the different deficits from previous years, plus interest and all of that. Now, what we're hearing a lot of is some fairly doom and gloom stuff about, the size of the deficit and it's, whether or not it's sustainable and whether or not this is going to mean future taxes, because as the saying goes, today's deficits are tomorrow's taxes, all these kinds of things. A lot of this is floating around, but a lot of it doesn't have a lot of context. And so I thought we'd give a little bit of that today and see where that takes us. So one of the things you're going to see floating around the internet is a lot of talk about the size of the current federal deficit. This is one of those numbers that we need to kind of put into context because, well, the federal deficit may be in several billions of dollars, we need to think of that in the context of the Canadian economy being about $1 trillion in total. So when you're looking at a deficit of 18 to 20 billion, for example, that is, a minuscule less than 1% of the size of the economy. So we need to kind of put that figure in perspective. An 18, $20 billion deficit is very small in comparison to the size of the economy. So when people say it's a massive deficit, it's not really. It may look like a big number because we're not used to seeing that number in context of the size of the entire thing that we're trying to measure. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. The other thing in terms of this notion that today's deficits are tomorrow's taxes doesn't really take into account the current situation when it comes to things like interest rates and levels of growth. We are currently in a period where interest rates are below inflation, which means that for a government which can borrow pretty much as it needs, it's almost getting free money to a certain extent because the rate at which the economy is growing is faster than the rate at which interest is being accumulated. So that gives a lot of fiscal flexibility for governments to take that money and do something with it that they think will help to further help grow the economy. And it's one of those things where if your economy grows enough, it can take care of deficits on their own. We saw this in the 1990s when, yes, we did have a series of government cuts, but we also saw the economy expanding at a rapid rate, and that growth is largely what helped to eliminate the federal deficits. There's the famous phrase that went around that Justin Trudeau said was that when your economy is growing, the budget will balance itself. Now, certain parties went and truncated that and said he believes that budgets balance themselves, and which is not what he said. What he said, about when the economy grows is absolutely correct. But that was not a good soundbite for parties to try and spin on their own. So that's one of those things that we need to keep in mind when it comes to what the state of the economy is right now. Canadian economy is growing at a pretty good clip. We're being buffeted by a lot of international forces. The trade wars that our neighbor to the south keeps trying to start is one of the big ones that is really kind of putting a drag on what our economy is at right now. But for the most part, we're growing. We are in a very good position nominally. So we can expect some decent growth in the near future at very least. So that's one of the things we need to kind of keep in mind. So one of the things we need to think about this is the way in which parties are trying to spin a narrative around these numbers. For example, the Conservatives are trying to spin the narrative that the government has out of control spending and therefore you need their fiscal prudence to rein it in, for example. Even though it's not really necessarily the case that that's what's going on. We're seeing, for example, in Ontario, where the Conservative government there is trying to say that the previous government spending was bankrupting the province, even though it's nowhere even close to bankruptcy. The province was able to borrow essentially for free and was trying to use that money in certain investments that would, supposedly stimulate the economy. That's the thinking behind it. I'm not enough of an economist to know whether or not that's the case, but I do know that this narrative about them bankrupting the province is false. And this is one of the things that federally we need to look at, this kind of pattern of trying to put the same narrative onto the current government as well. Again, it's one of these things where they keep saying the government is running huge deficits, but they're not huge. The debt to GDP ratio is declining, which means that the amount that the economy is growing relative to the debt is that the economy is growing at a much faster rate than the debt. So that ratio is constantly declining, and that's an important thing to look at. Ours is one of the best debt to GDP ratios in the G7. So it's a context in terms of other economies that we're doing pretty good on this because we did have a good, solid number of years of fiscal discipline. And despite the fact that there is a deficit being run right now, there is a certain level of discipline still being applied to it. It's just that the government has decided that they want to use the fiscal room they've got to invest in other things. A lot of it's been infrastructure, which is a bit complicated because a lot of this needs to have provincial buy-in, and we've had instances where provinces had reduced their own infrastructure spending because the federal government was investing, and therefore we didn't get the growth multipliers that we were hoping for. So that is an issue, but it's something that we need to kind of put into that context. So with this in mind, as we're heading toward an election, I think it's good for us to have this kind of context in place because we should want to have an adult discussion about where the state of the country's finances are. So you've got people on one side saying it's all doom, they're running deficits, this is all bad, this is going to mean future taxes, even though the declining debt to GDP ratio means exactly that we won't need to raise taxes because the rate of growth is eclipsing the rate at which the debt is increasing. So, you can keep on this path and you can eliminate your debt and deficit without necessarily needing to raise taxes. The other side of this is you've got a government who is possibly lowballing what their figures are. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's better to be prudent in terms of your numbers and, come out with a bigger surplus or even a smaller deficit if that's the case at the end than you kind of went in thinking around your numbers. But that's also just one of those things that we need to remember that is possibly the case. And given the numbers that we're seeing, that's probably what's happening right now. There was a Scotia economics report a couple of weeks ago that said that because revenue growth for the government has been on fire lately, that if they didn't make any additional spending commitments, the deficit would be eliminated on its own in possibly 3 years. So that's something, again, that we need to kind of think about as voters, that, are we getting exactly the proper picture? That was partially why the previous government decided to create the Parliamentary Budget Office, was so that there would be this kind of neutral forecasting of that, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily lived up to its role because the Parliamentary Budget Officer got kind of co-opted into doing all kinds of other analyses instead. So I think that's, as voters, we need to kind of keep that in mind. There is a context to numbers. We should seek out that context and try and get a better understanding than just taking the words of the leaders saying that, oh, everything is doom, or oh, everything is great. try and do some reading, find some economic analysis out there. It's not that difficult to find. And, let's try and make this an adult discussion in the next election. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe to the channel, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.